Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
On Monday morning, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood outside his residence in Ottawa and made the announcement that after 9 years leading the country, he'll be stepping down.
I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister.
The decision came after years of growing economic strains in Canada and months of political turmoil for Trudeau and the Liberal Party he leads.
For the past 3 weeks, everyone's felt that Trudeau was not going to survive this, and on Monday, he made it official, calling a leadership race to replace him.
Brian Platt covers Canada for Bloomberg and has been chronicling every twist and turn of Trudeau's fall. He's based in Ottawa, and he was there at Rideau Cottage for the announcement, braving the negative 14 degrees Celsius chill. That's about 7 degrees Fahrenheit.
There was one little propane heater that we were all rotating around, and Trudeau came out and spoke to us for about 45 minutes. It was kind of understated the way that you would normally see Trudeau speak. There was moments where you could catch a bit of emotion to his voice. Like, he had a phrase he used a couple of times, always been a fighter.
Every bone in my body has always told me to fight because I care deeply about Canadians. I care deeply about this country.
And his voice caught a little bit. His eyes looked a little bit puffy, but maybe that was just because of the cold. But he did not want to do this. I think that's the biggest thing that people should realize is Trudeau was fully preparing to fight the next election. And ultimately, it just became untenable for him to hang on as leader. And so against all of his instincts and all of his intentions, he was forced into this position. And I think you could really see that in his speech yesterday.
Today on the show, how housing costs, inflation, and the looming threat of U.S. tariffs helped force Trudeau into this position, and what Canada's rightward shift and current leadership vacuum means for the country's economy and its position on the global stage. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. Over the past few months, as Trudeau's polling numbers dropped, the Conservative opposition gained steam, and Trudeau's allies in the Liberal Party started turning against him. But Brian says, for a while, he still didn't think Trudeau would actually resign.
I mean, I talked to him through news conferences. I talked to a lot of his inner circle. I was very convinced all the way through that Trudeau was not going to step down. Despite his bad polling numbers, he believed he could turn it around and win the next election, which is going to happen sometime in 2025. And right up until December 16th, I would have told you that same answer. Trudeau is not stepping down.
But then on December 16th, his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, publicly quit, and the tides turned. Freeland was also deputy prime minister, pretty much the second most important person in the government. And she'd been a long-time Trudeau ally. So this split, it was a grab the popcorn moment in Canadian politics.
She published a letter criticizing Trudeau, really. It didn't directly call him out, but it very clearly criticized him and said he was not preparing seriously enough for the threat of tariffs under Donald Trump, that he was too focused on sort of populist measures, she called them political gimmicks, and not preparing for what might be a major trade war. And the moment that Chrystia Freeland quit, and quit in such a public way, it really changed everything. It kind of cut the legs out from under Trudeau. And his party, I would say, decisively turned against him after that happened.
Brian says what happened to cause such a split between Freeland and Trudeau isn't completely clear. But we do know that he was planning to replace her as finance minister in an attempt to try to revitalize his government with fresh faces, a new narrative. His administration thought that might help improve their polling numbers. Trudeau offered Freeland a new job, overseeing U.S.-Canadian relations.
I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think if you look at the tone of her letter, she saw this as a humiliating demotion, that she was no longer going to be running a government department. But I have to say, the manner in which she did this, was kind of calculated to inflict maximum damage on the prime minister. And I know there are people around Trudeau now who were very taken by surprise with how Chrystia Freeland did this, and are wondering if this was a play by her, essentially, to take out the prime minister and run for leadership herself. I want to be clear, I'm not reporting that that's why she did this, but there are people around Trudeau who are wondering that. Absolutely.
Well, let's step back for a moment. Trudeau served for 9 years. When he first took office, he was a pretty popular leader. He came to the role as the son of a beloved former prime minister. His cabinet featured an equal number of men and women, which is a first for Canada.
I understand one of the priorities for you was to have a cabinet that was gender balanced. Why was that so important to you?
Because it's 2015.
In his first few years in office, he declared Canada open for anyone fleeing persecution, terror, and war, and initiated reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people. Those are just a few of the things that he did. Can you just chart his rise and fall for us?
When Trudeau became Liberal leader, the Liberals had suffered a devastating election defeat in 2011. They were in third place. They weren't even the official opposition party, and this is a party that has governed Canada for much of the past 100 years. So they were in a really bad place. In many ways, they were in the worst place that they'd been in modern Canadian history. And Trudeau came in and absolutely reinvigorated and energized the party and really created a big youth movement. I mean, when he won the election in 2015, younger voters really propelled him into office. There was a huge turnout in that election, and he was promising things that appealed to younger voters. He promised to legalize recreational marijuana use. He promised a big tax cut that raised taxes on the highest income earners and cut them for everybody else. He also brought the Liberal Party, I would say, much further to the left, especially economically, than it had been a very centrist party. It's maybe a little much to say he reinvented the Liberal Party, but he really did change it when he came in. And he won a big election victory in 2015 and stayed on as Prime Minister for 9, almost 10 years. But what happened after the pandemic, especially with inflation and the rise in housing prices in particular, really cut into him, and that was when things really changed.
Well, yeah, what were those issues that really brought Trudeau and the Liberal Party he leads to this inflection point?
I remember the timeline when the polling started to change dramatically for Trudeau, because it was the summer of 2023 when the narrative really took over that nobody could afford a house in Canada anymore. Rents had exploded and housing prices had exploded, and interest rates were high because of, various global factors, in particular around supply chains and so on.
This is sounding familiar.
Yes. Yes. This was not just a particularly Canadian problem, right? Although there's one thing that I think did exacerbate the problem in Canada, which is after the pandemic, Trudeau's government kind of lost control of the immigration system, especially on temporary foreign workers and international students. So there's a few things I think that fed into it, but there was a huge surge. Canada brought in, I believe within 12 months at one point, the number was 1.2 million people in a country of about 40 million people. The population growth rate exploded, and it blew up the housing market. On top of the inflation problem around food prices and everything else that the rest of the world was experiencing, inflation in Canada, just like it did in every other developed country, I mean, it's killer for an incumbent government. And one thing I thought was interesting was that well into the summer of 2024, when inflation was actually pretty much under control in Canada, but if you looked at polling, inflation was either the number one or the number two issue for many, many months after it had been brought back under control. And I do think that there is, along with the specific Canadian elements I mentioned, the global anti-incumbent movement, especially around the inflation surge that came after the pandemic, took a bite out of Trudeau, absolutely. And so he was always going to be up against it to try to recover from that.
Trudeau will stay in office until his Liberal Party chooses a new leader. What will the process look like? Who are the frontrunners to replace him? And what vision for Canada's economic and political future are they promising? That's after the break. Trudeau's resignation comes at the start of an election year for Canada. The country will hold its national election by October at the latest, which would have already been a tight deadline for a new political leader to gain support. But, as Bloomberg's Brian Platt explained, when Trudeau resigned on Monday, he also asked to suspend the parliament to allow his Liberal Party some breathing room to choose a new leader. When Parliament returns, there's a strong chance it'll be thrust into an election right away.
There's a lot of parliamentary drama right now because the three big opposition parties here have all now promised to vote against the government at the next opportunity. So you have this election deadline hanging over everything right now. And Parliament is suspended, but it will come back on March 24th. And when it comes back, you will pretty quickly have a confidence vote. And if the opposition parties follow through on what they promised, they will defeat the government and that will trigger an election. So that's a pretty hard deadline to get a new leader into place. You basically have 2 months, give or take a week or two.
Well, so who are the frontrunners that are kind of emerging right now as Canada searches for new leadership for its parties?
Well, Freeland is probably the biggest name that everyone's talking about right now. Mark Carney. He's the former central bank governor of Canada and of England, and holds many other positions right now, including the chair of Bloomberg Inc., we should disclose, but also the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, a very prominent and well-established global figure. We wrote a story on Monday night, shortly after Trudeau gave his speech, that Mark Carney is considering running for the leadership. But you've got a bunch of other cabinet ministers around Trudeau who may run. So there actually is a pretty big potential pool here.
And all this comes at a time when President-elect Donald Trump has threatened to impose steep tariffs of 25% on Canadian exports to the U.S. once he takes office. With Trudeau on his way out and his cabinet leaders potentially preparing to run for leadership themselves, Brian says the country's negotiating power with the U.S. could be weakened.
It's a very not ideal situation for a Canadian government dealing with a potentially economically devastating threat south of the border. Trump has already been mocking Canada, right? And mocking Trudeau, calling Canada the 51st state, calling Trudeau the governor of Canada. And now Trudeau will just be the absolute definition of a lame duck or a custodian leader at this point, because he has said he has resigned, but he's just staying in office until his successor is chosen. So he's already on his way out. And I think the only thing potentially that might help Trudeau in that situation is that he maybe has a bit more freedom to do some politically unpopular things, because he personally will not be facing voters in an election.
But as Brian mentioned, the outlook for Trudeau's Liberal Party in the upcoming election is gloomy. It's been trailing the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre.
You know, the sort of catch-all term that people use for him is he's populist. He does have a very aggressive way of speaking, very blunt. He's also a pretty polarizing figure. And there's a lot of Canadians on the other side who will be quite repelled by him. But he is in many ways, at least when it comes to policy and in his vision of government, just the total opposite of Justin Trudeau. If you go essentially from a Trudeau government to a Pierre Poilievre government, it will be a huge turn for Canada. The kinds of things Poilievre is talking about doing are build more fossil fuel projects, unleash Canada's oil and gas sector, and reduce the size of government and cut taxes. If Poilievre comes in with a large majority government, so controls most of the seats in Parliament, you know, he potentially will come in and make some pretty big changes that will just be, you know, quite a sharp turn from what we've seen in the Trudeau era. And it's going to be very interesting to see, if you take Justin Trudeau out of the picture, can a new Liberal leader eat into the commanding lead that Poilievre has? Because at the moment, it sure looks like he's heading for a huge victory. And the Liberal Party, you know, might be back in the wilderness where it was before Justin Trudeau took over, you know, more than 10 years ago.
Well, as you said, a lot of this sounds a little bit familiar when you're looking at the global stage. Canada is just the latest country that's poised for this consequential change in leadership. It's seeing a rightward shift. France ousted its prime minister last month. Germany is headed for a snap election next month. Trump is about to take office in the U.S. How does this news from Canada fit into that global picture in your eyes? How should listeners be thinking about this moment of global political upheaval?
It does fit into the narrative and the established track record that it's just a very bad time to be an incumbent government right now. And Trudeau spent last year watching a lot of his G7 counterparts get taken out in elections. And they wanted to delay an election as long as they could into 2025 to try to avoid the fate that you had seen in a lot of these other G7 countries. And that was the hope. survive this period of global instability and global backlash, especially related to inflation. Survive this, get through it. And, 2025, interest rates are lower. Inflation is receding into people's memory. This is a chance to sort of turn things around. That's what Trudeau wanted to do. Avoid the fate that he had seen around the rest of the world. And ultimately, he has not been able to do it. Domestic political events eventually forced his hand.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Alex Tai. It was edited by Tracy Samuelson and Laura Dillon Kane. It was mixed and sound designed by Alex Sugiura. It was fact-checked by Adriana Tapia. Our senior producer is Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamsterboer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.